I'm Chandler Morse, Vice President of Public Policy at Workday, and I'm thrilled to be talking to Victoria Espinel, CEO of BSA, the Software Alliance. We're going to dive into the world of AI policy, global regulations, and the future of responsible AI. Victoria, thank you so much for being here.
I am so happy to be here.
Let's get started. Let's open with some quick background on BSA, the Software Alliance. Workday is a member, so I'm very familiar with your work, but for the viewers, could you just cover a little bit about the organization and the work that you do?
Yes, so BSA is, we bring together enterprise software companies from around the world to work on technology policy around the world. We're very global as an organization. We're based in DC, but we have offices and an amazing team around the world, and we focus just on enterprise software companies. So that's the perspective that we bring to policy making. We work on a range of tech policy issues, but I will tell you, at the moment, a lot of what we're doing is artificial intelligence policy. There has been an enormous spike in activity.
And I know you have a global footprint, so we're going to cover some of that as we talk about AI. But before we get started, AI for you. Worrisome, great opportunity, little in the middle, how are you viewing that?
I think it's potentially both. So I think it's, it's like any tool, really. Like if it's mishandled, there will be significant concerns. On the other hand, I think there is an enormous upside if it's used responsibly. And so, this is sort of the pivotal moment, I think, for not just the United States, but sort of this is, society as a whole to decide how we're going to use it and what we're going to do to try to encourage AI to be used in a responsible way. But I think there's enormous opportunity if we get this moment right.
That's right. So you mentioned that AI policy work is a big focus for BSA. Can you give sort of, and I want to dive into a few regions, but can we just start at the high level? What is BSA currently doing? When you say we're working on AI policy, what does that mean?
So that means that we're working with governments around the world, because governments around the world right now are trying to decide if and how they're going to regulate artificial intelligence. So what we do is we're in discussions with governments as they're figuring out that approach, giving them our suggestions and our feedback and our expertise on artificial intelligence. One of the issues we're spending a lot of time on is how to reduce the risk of bias and discrimination in artificial intelligence, which is a very important issue. But as I said, there's a lot of activity. There are a lot of governments that are taking this very seriously.
Have you seen, we've talked a little bit about this before, BSA has been involved in a number of privacy issues, cybersecurity, or a number of policy issues, cybersecurity, privacy, workforce, sustainability. Have you seen the kind of interest that we're seeing in AI from a policymaker point of view before?
I've been doing technology policy for a long time, and I've never seen this type of interest in so many different places in the world at the same time. And it's not that there wasn't interest in AI policy before. There are a number of countries, Japan among them, the UK, the United States, that have been thinking about this. But this sort of surge in interest, particularly in the last 9 months or so, is unprecedented. I've never seen anything like it.
Let's take a trip around the world. We'll start, because I think you would agree, at the moment all eyes are on Europe. So Europe is paving the way currently for implementing AI policy. When you think about what's going on in Europe, what do you like? What's a little bit concerning? And can you compare this a little bit to the privacy policy?
So Europe is definitely the furthest along in terms of drafting legislation. Europe has a draft law that has gone through a lot of the European process and will almost definitely go into force the next year. I think there are a lot of positives to the approach that Europe has taken, which is to focus on what are the most significant risks for artificial intelligence and then putting in obligations to try to reduce those. What's interesting about Europe, though, is not just that it's the first, but that other countries around the world are looking to Europe. A few years ago, Europe was the first, passed a privacy law. It was a very comprehensive privacy law, and a lot of other governments looked to it as a model. And the same thing will happen with artificial intelligence. What happens in Europe will not stay in Europe. It will be an influence around the world.
Workday works very closely. We have a team on the ground in Brussels, and I have to just a quick shout out to your team in the EU and the work that you're doing on the EU Policy Act. It's been really terrific.
Yeah, they are amazing.
Switching to the US. in the same ballpark as Europe, a little bit behind, a little bit ahead? What are you thinking in terms of, let's talk about Congress first.
Right. So the United States doesn't have a law that's as far along, and then in fact in the United States, in Congress, there are a number of draft bills that have been introduced, but nothing that has sort of progressed as far as things have in Europe. However, there is, again, sort of a very high level of interest among members of Congress. I think a sincere interest to try to understand artificial intelligence better, and I think a real desire to see if they can pass legislation, which is very challenging, regardless of the issue. It's hard to get legislation passed through the US Congress, but I think there is a lot of interest in doing so, and a lot of interest in figuring out the details of how to get it right.
Having spent over a decade on Capitol Hill, I can only agree with those comments. Switching to the administration side, do you see some bright spots there from on the U.S. side when it comes to AI policy development?
So the administration is also focused on it. I think there's been, again, a real surge of attention really since the release of ChatGPT. The White House has been working on voluntary commitments and working to try to get companies to take on board those voluntary commitments, but I don't think they want to stop there. In fact, I know they don't want to stop there. So I think voluntary commitments, they view it as sort of a first and important step, but I think they are also supportive of regulation. They're looking internally. You know, White Houses have tools that they can use, like things that are called executive orders. They can make rules for how agencies buy artificial intelligence, and there's a lot of sort of power in how they do that. It can have a big impact on the industry. So they're working with Congress on legislation, but they're also thinking about what tools do they have internally that they could use to put some mandatory rules around artificial intelligence.
Okay, I want to continue our trip around the world. Workday's a global company. BSA's got a global footprint. Let's talk about APJ, a region I know you're focused on. What are you seeing in the Asia Pacific area?
So, a couple of things. One is in the United States, we talked about Congress. We didn't have a chance to talk about the states, but there's a lot of activity happening at the U.S. state level as well. In Europe, most of that conversation has been about the risks in artificial intelligence and how to address those, which is very important. In the APJ region, there's really two conversations going on. One is about risk and how to address it, but the second is governments wanting to make sure that they are putting in place the research and development and the innovation capabilities so that they can be innovating in the AI space and get the benefits of that. So it's a slightly different conversation. It's also one that's moving very quickly. So Japan has been working on artificial intelligence policy for many years through a process called the G7. Singapore has been thinking about it, but in terms of drafting legislation, there's been a significant uptick in activity. Yeah. So now you have Australia drafting, South Korea drafting, India drafting, Japan kind of finalizing what its approach is going to be, Singapore drafting. It's very, very active. And again, it's sort of all happening at this moment, which I think creates an enormous opportunity.
Agreed. I think it's interesting, Singapore and Japan, for example, not new to the AI conversation, having been in the AI conversation. Singapore, a thought leader, Japan with the national strategy, but now with the advent of large language models and generative AI and the focus, it seems like they're all taking another look. Hey, do we have the tools that we need? Should we do more? Another part of the world we haven't talked about yet that is also the UK. So counterposed a little bit with Europe. I've heard kind of a way of describing this framework of Europe is looking at very rigorous regulatory requirements. The U.S. maybe a little bit more hands-off, a little bit behind, and UK playing kind of a middle role. Do you think of it like that?
Yeah, I think so. The UK is in a really interesting place because they left the European Union, and so now they they have a policy approach where, and they were always, I think they always played the role that you described in the European Union system, but now they're doing it independently. They are another country that's been thinking about AI policy for years. I think they might have been the first government that I'm aware of that had, and this is maybe 5 or 6 years ago now, that had someone inside the government specifically tasked with thinking about artificial intelligence policy. They are having a global summit the beginning of November, where they are bringing in digital ministers and heads of state from around the world. So it's an enormous focus for the UK, all the way up to the level of the Prime Minister. And I think they are trying to find an approach that puts sensible guardrails on artificial intelligence, but also leaves room for innovation. I think that's their approach to policy in general.
It's an interesting, I think we've all heard this is an issue that is of personal interest with the Prime Minister,
yes.
which is also, I think, a tremendous opportunity. So let me ask you this: we're gonna zoom out for a minute. We've got, and we can talk for a second about the states. We've got the U.S. government, we've got the EU, we've got the UK, we've got governments in the APJ. How important is harmonizing these approaches?
I think it's very important. It's incredibly helpful for companies, but also for people to have predictability and not have very different rules depending upon what part of the world that they're on. And I think there's this moment for collaboration among governments that won't last forever. I think it's like a 6-month, maybe a 12-month window, but right now, in all the work that we do talking to governments around the world, I think there is a sincere desire to work together and collaborate on this. And so it's one that I know the United States, the UK, Japan, Singapore, the European Union are aware of that as well. And so I really hope and think they will seize this opportunity to try to work together. It's very unusual to have this happen.
A level.
To have this happen at this level. And as you said, at the head of state level as well, to have this focus. So I think it's a great opportunity.
You have to pardon this segue, but I can't miss it. Head of state, let's talk about the states. So
Okay.
if you are a student of tech policy, I think one of the things we saw was in the privacy context, Europe moved. There's some focus on congressional action that we're still focusing on, but the states haven't waited. Do you anticipate a similar trend when it comes to AI policy?
I think it is already happening. So in fact, just this morning, BSA put out a report where we have seen an increase in activity at the state legislature of 440%. I mean, it's just an enormous surge of activity. You're absolutely right. States started passing laws around privacy a few years ago, and I think there's a lot of interest in passing laws on artificial intelligence at the state level. So whereas in Congress, I think there's a good chance. I think in the states, laws have already started to be passed, and more will continue, 100%.
440% increase.
440%.
Okay. Workday, all in on the ability for AI to unlock human potential, very focused and supportive of AI regulatory safeguards to build trust and support innovation. From BSAs, we've deputized you Chief AI Policy of, if you're writing the regulatory framework or the policy path forward, what do you want to see in it that's important?
So I would say the main thing, I think, is to prioritize, to really focus on what are the highest risks. What are the worst case scenarios? What are the places where artificial intelligence could have a negative impact on someone's ability to get healthcare or to get a job or to get access to public benefits? There's a lot of uses of artificial intelligence that don't create big risks for people. So don't focus a lot of attention on those. I think policymakers should be focusing on the highest risk and then putting in place obligations for companies, whether they're creating AI or using AI, Workday, you do both, to make sure that they have internal processes in place to make sure that risks are being reduced to the extent possible, and if they find problems, that problems are being fixed quickly. I think that if policymakers take that approach, I think that will be long-term, sustainable, workable. I think that would be enormously beneficial.
I want to close out circling back to responsible AI. You mentioned it at the beginning. Workday is, we launched our principles in 2019. We have our responsible AI program with leadership commitment, with our cross-functional teams, with our guidelines and review processes. BSA has also been heavily involved, an enterprise risk framework that you all put out. Your companies are focused on responsible AI, your members, not unlike Workday. What do you think is driving that enterprise interest in responsible AI?
So I think it's a couple of things. One is, I think it's, a number of our companies have been thinking about these issues for a long time. So they're not new to them. They've been thinking about how to be responsible in the space for many, many years. I think there is a recognition that people aren't going to want to use artificial intelligence unless they feel like they can trust the technology. So it is in everyone's interest to try to make sure that it's being used responsibly for so many reasons. And I think there's a lot that can be done. I mean, you all are doing this. So, there are really practical steps that aren't that difficult. Putting in independent review mechanisms, bringing people from all parts of the company together to work on this, having buy-in from the CEO. All of those things are doable. You all are doing them, so you're an example of how it can be done. And that can have enormous impact on a company's use of responsible AI.
Thank you so much. We're going to park it there. Can't thank you enough. Thank you for joining me today, Victoria. This was a very insightful conversation.